Let me tell you about a cold morning in April of 1987 in Buchanan County, Iowa. The ground was still soft from a late thaw, and if you'd been there, you would have smelled diesel in the air and wet gravel and the sharp green scent of something trying to come back to life after a long winter. Behind the county courthouse, about 60 men stood in a loose half circle, hands pushed deep into their jacket pockets, collars up against the wind. An auctioneer from Waterloo was setting up his microphone on a little wooden platform, and 3 farms were going to change hands that morning. All 3 foreclosed. All 3 inside of 12 miles of each other. All 3 belonging, until that week, to families who had lived on that ground since before the First World War. Now here's what you need to understand about the men in that crowd. Most of them were bankers or buyers from Des Moines, or corporate scouts from as far away as Chicago. A few of them were local farmers come to watch, the way you watch a house fire across the street. Because you have to, and because you're quietly thanking God it isn't yours. One man in particular was standing off to the side with a clipboard. His name was Donovan Keller. Don, to anybody who knew him. Loan officer at First Prairie Savings out of Cedar Rapids. Pressed shirt, clean shave, quietly satisfied with himself because the paperwork was in order, and he expected the land to go to a corporate buyer by 10 o'clock. Smooth morning, clean books, home by lunch. And that's when Arlen Vance walked up from the back of the crowd. Now, I want you to picture this man, 58 years old, a brown canvas barn coat so worn that both elbows had been patched, and the cuffs were frayed down to the threads, boots splitting at the toe. He looked like a man who had wandered out of the wrong decade and couldn't quite find his way back. A couple of the younger fellas in the crowd nudged each other. Somebody laughed, not cruel. Just that easy, familiar laughter men use when a sight is a little bit funny and a little bit sad at the same time. A man in a feed store cap called out, "Arlen, you lost? Coffee's over at the diner." Arlen gave him a small nod, didn't smile, didn't answer, kept his eyes on the auctioneer. And here's the thing, everybody in that crowd knew Arlen Vance. They'd known him for 30 years. They'd seen him at the co-op meetings and the church suppers and the 4th of July picnics. He was the man who wouldn't borrow for a new combine in 1972, when every other farmer in the county was stretching for one. He was the man who wouldn't borrow when land prices went vertical in 1978. His wife Marjorie still drove a 1968 Ford. He still wore the same coat he'd bought in 1968. Around those parts, Arlen was what they called the tight man, the stuck man. Everybody knew Arlen, and everybody figured they knew what Arlen was. They were about to find out they didn't know the first thing about him. The auctioneer cleared his throat and read the first parcel, 240 acres along County Road B. The old Halverson place. Opening bid, $480 an acre. Arlen raised his hand, once. A corporate buyer from Des Moines raised his. Arlen raised his again. Back and forth it went. And on the 5th round, the man from Des Moines shook his head and stepped off. The gavel came down, and Arlen Vance, the man in the patched coat, the man everybody had spent 30 years politely laughing at, had just bought 240 acres of prime Iowa bottomland. Outright, cash. No financing, no contingency. Don Keller looked up from his clipboard. He frowned. He checked his paperwork. He looked at Arlen again, and you could see him trying to make the arithmetic in his head work out. And it wouldn't. Before noon, Arlen had bought 2 of the 3 farms on the block, 520 acres. Paid in full. Cashier's checks, every one of them drawn on a small bank in Independence, Iowa, where a man named Arlen Vance had been making deposits, quietly, without interruption, for 26 years. And this is the part that matters. On the drive home that afternoon, Arlen passed the Halverson place. And there, sitting on the porch steps of the house he no longer owned, was Ray Halverson, with a cardboard box of kitchen things next to him, just sitting there. Arlen slowed the truck. He pulled into the gravel drive. The 2 men looked at each other across about 10 feet of empty yard. Arlen didn't get out. He didn't say a word. He just gave Ray the kind of nod a man gives when there's nothing he can say that would be adequate to the moment. And then he put the truck in gear and drove on home. Now, you're going to want to know how a man in a patched coat walked into a courthouse auction with enough cash in the bank to buy 2 farms before lunch. You're going to want to know why he did it. And more than that, because this story isn't really about the morning of the auction, you're going to want to know what he did next. Because the answer to all of that is sitting in the top drawer of a roll-top desk in the front room of Arlen Vance's farmhouse. It's a tan accountant's ledger with a cracked spine. And on the inside cover, in faded ink, in a handwriting that isn't Arlen's, there's a single year written. 1918. That ledger was started by Arlen's grandfather. It was carried on by Arlen's father. And by the autumn of 1987, it had allowed Arlen Vance, the tight man, the stuck man, the man they'd been laughing at for 40 years, to own, free and clear, nearly 900 acres of the best soil in Buchanan County, without a single dollar of debt against any of it. But that ledger is not the story either. The story is what was written on the last page. And to understand that, we have to go back, way back, to a winter evening in 1949, when a 20-year-old boy came home from a mechanic's shop in Dubuque, and his father sat him down in the front room and pulled that tan ledger off a shelf for the first time. Let me take you back to January of 1949. The war had been over for almost 4 years. Arlen Vance was 20 years old, and 2 weeks earlier, he had been standing in a mechanic's shop in Dubuque with grease on his hands and a pretty good future in front of him if he wanted it. Then a letter came from his mother. 4 lines. "It's time, son. Your father is slowing down. The farm needs you. Come home." So he came home. Now, if you'd walked into the Vance farmhouse that winter, you would have known everything you needed to know about the family in about 30 seconds. There was a kerosene smell in the mudroom from the lamp they still kept trimmed by the back door, even though the place had electricity by then. The third stair from the bottom creaked in a particular way. And it had creaked that way since before Arlen was born. The front room window faced west, and in the late afternoon the light came through it gold, and then it turned blue, and then the house went dark. And that was how you knew it was 4 o'clock, then 5, then time for supper. Arlen's father was a man named Walter Vance, born in 1892. He had come home from the fields of France in 1919 with a limp he never talked about, and he'd taken over the farm from his own father a few years after that. Walter had big, knuckled hands. He didn't say much, and he wasn't the sort of man who lectured his son. He showed his son. That was always his way. One evening that January, after the supper dishes were put away and Arlen's mother had gone upstairs, Walter motioned for Arlen to follow him into the front room. He reached up to a shelf above the roll-top desk and he pulled down a tan accountant's ledger, cracked spine, worn corners. He set it on the desk, and he opened it to the inside cover, and in faded pencil, in a careful hand that wasn't Walter's, was a single year. 1918. "This was your grandfather's," Walter said. "Edgar started it the year I went over. He kept it until he died. I've kept it since. And now you're going to keep it." Arlen sat down, and for the first time in his life, his father walked him through what was in that book. Now here's what you need to understand. The ledger had 3 columns. On the left side, in Edgar Vance's pencil, was every loan the family had ever taken, every single one, the reason for it, the amount, and the year it was paid off. It was a short list. A note for a team of horses in 1921. A note for a threshing machine in 1924. Both of them crossed out, with the dates they'd been cleared. On the right side, and this is the part that matters, was a much longer list. Every loan the family had refused to take. A tractor loan, offered in 1927, declined. An expansion loan, offered in 1928, declined. A loan to buy a quarter section from a neighbor in 1929, declined. And then, in the middle of that page, there was a single pencil line drawn straight across, a dividing line. Below it, in Edgar's shakier handwriting, dated November of 1932, were these words: "Neighbors Jens Halverson, the Carlsons, the Peterson brothers, sheriff's auction, lost everything. Could have been us." And below that, 3 lines in Walter's younger hand, dated 1935. Dad said, "Banks do not lend you money. They rent you time, and they set the clock." Arlen looked up at his father, and Walter, who did not lecture, lectured him exactly once, that night. He told Arlen what his own father had told him in the cold winter of 1933. The winter after the auctions. He said that in the good years, debt feels like a partnership. Feels like the bank is on your side. Feels like you and the loan officer are building something together. But in the bad years, Walter said, debt reveals what it always was. It's a leash. And the man holding the other end of it is not your partner. The Halversons in 32 were not worse farmers than we were. Walter told him. They were the same farmers, maybe better, some years. The difference was that in 28, Jens borrowed to buy a quarter section off a man who was retiring. Your grandfather was offered the same deal, same land, same price. He said no. When wheat hit 38 cents a bushel and corn hit 19, Jens lost that new quarter section. Then he lost the old one. Then he lost the house. We lost nothing, because we owed nothing. And then Walter showed his son the other two things that had made refusal possible. Because a man can't just say no to the bank and call that a plan. A man has to be able to live through the no. So Walter walked him through the farm, the way Edgar had once walked Walter through it. There was a kitchen garden that fed the family from May to October, and a cellar that fed them from October to May. There was a smokehouse out back, 2 milk cows, a flock of layers, a woodlot for heat, a coal stove as a backup. Preserves lined up on shelves in jars that Arlen's mother had been filling every August for 25 years. Walter said to him, Edgar built this place so that in a bad year we could live for 18 months without selling a single bushel. That's not being cheap, son. That's engineering. The farm has to feed itself first. Then it feeds the market. And the second thing Walter said was harder. He said, you're going to watch the neighbors, Arlen. You're going to see them buy new tractors and new trucks and new land. And you're going to feel something. Don't measure yourself by their yardstick. Their yardstick is someone else's schedule, and you don't know whose. I drive a 1939 Alice Chalmers, not because I can't afford better, because better is not my clock. Arlen didn't say anything. He just nodded. He took the ledger, and he carried it back up to his own room that night, and he read it through, cover to cover, by the light of a single bulb. Walter Vance died in August of 1956. Went down in the soybean field on a hot Tuesday afternoon. They buried him on the Friday. Arlen was 27 years old, and he inherited the farm, the roll-top desk, and the ledger. And inside it, on a page dated June of 56, 2 months before Walter died, was his father's last entry. The neighbor to the east borrowed $18,000 for the new deer. It will not end well. That autumn, Arlen sat down at the kitchen table, opened the ledger to the inside back cover, and wrote 5 lines in black ink in his own careful hand. Never a dollar borrowed against the land. Never a dollar borrowed against the crop. Buy only what is fully paid. Keep 2 years of living money in the bank. Wait, he was 27 years old when he wrote that, and he did not change a single word of it for the next 31 years. But here's what nobody told him. What Edgar hadn't written, and what Walter hadn't lived long enough to see. Those 5 lines were going to cost him something. Not money, something harder. Because the next 31 years, Arlen Vance was going to spend being quietly, patiently, unmistakably laughed at by every man he knew. And that's the part of the story we have to talk about next. Now, I want you to try to imagine what 31 years look like in a single ledger. Arlen's columns were narrower than his father's, because Arlen was a more systematic man than Walter had been. On the left side of every page, every expense, every year, paid in cash. On the right side, every year's net deposit at the small bank in Independence, Iowa. In the middle, a running total. And that running total began in the autumn of 1956 at $0. And from there, it grew. Not steeply, not dramatically, never in a straight line up, but without interruption, year after year after year. Let me introduce you to his neighbors, because you're going to need to know them. To the north was Ray Halverson, 300 acres, decent farmer, well-liked, first man to show up at a barn raising with a toolbox and a casserole from his wife. And here's the part that'll stay with you. Ray was the grandson of that same Jens Halverson, whose name was written in Edgar Vance's ledger in the November of 1932. The Halversons had lost the ground in the Depression. Ray's father had scraped and saved and bought it back in the 1940s. Ray had inherited it, whole, in 1968. To the south were the Peterson brothers, 480 acres, on land their grandfather had also lost in 32, and their father had bought back a piece at a time through the 40s and 50s. And to the west was Marv Carlson, 220 acres, and the best-looking equipment in the county every year, without fail. Now, the 1960s were fine for everybody. Corn prices held, land prices held. A man could plant, harvest, pay his bills, put a little aside, and sleep at night. Nothing to write home about, and nothing to worry about. Then came the 1970s, and this is where it started to split. In 1972, the Soviet Union bought a massive quantity of American wheat in a deal that took everybody by surprise, and grain prices went vertical overnight. In 1973, land in Buchanan County that had been going for $400 an acre in January was going for $900 an acre by the following summer. The federal government, the United States Department of Agriculture, was standing up and telling farmers, on the radio and in pamphlets, and at every county fair, to plant fence row to fence row. And the banks in Cedar Rapids and Waterloo and Dubuque were writing notes as fast as men could sign them. Ray Halverson borrowed $62,000 in 1974 to buy an extra 80 acres at $1,100 an acre. Everybody said the land would be worth $2,000 an acre inside of 5 years. And at the co-op, they weren't wrong to say it. That's what it looked like. Marv Carlson borrowed $40,000 for a brand new combine. The Peterson brothers borrowed against their land to buy more land. Everybody was building. Everybody was expanding. And Arlen Vance was not. Arlen was planting the same 180 acres he had always planted. He was driving the same 1961 International tractor his father had bought used in 1964. He was wearing the same brown canvas coat he had bought in 1968. And Marjorie was patching the elbows every other winter. And the laughter, now. The laughter was never cruel. Iowa in the 1970s was still a place with manners, but it was there. Old Arlen. Still running that international, still got the same patches on his elbows. Nice fella. Just a little behind the times. In the spring of 1976, a young man from the Farm Bureau drove out to the Vance place with a briefcase full of pamphlets. Clean-cut kid, maybe 25 years old, shiny shoes. He sat at Arlen's kitchen table, and he explained leverage. He explained very patiently that Arlen was leaving money on the table. He explained that land appreciation alone would cover the note. He explained that in 5 years, the loan would be paying itself. Marjorie poured the young man a cup of coffee. Arlen listened to the whole thing. He didn't interrupt. He thanked the young man. He took the pamphlet. He walked the young man to his car. And when the car was out of sight, Arlen walked back into the kitchen, opened the door of the wood stove, and put the pamphlet on the fire. Now here's what you need to understand. That was not a man being proud. That was not a man being stubborn. That was a man who had, in a desk drawer 15 feet from that wood stove, a ledger that started in 1918 and had a pencil line drawn across one of its pages, dated November of '32. And next to that line, in his grandfather's hand, was a list of 3 family names: Halverson, Carlson, Peterson. Arlen had been reading that list since he was 20 years old. He knew what it was. And then came 1979. A man named Paul Volcker became the chairman of the Federal Reserve that year, and he had decided that inflation was going to be broken, and the only way to break it was to raise interest rates. So he raised them. Farm loans that had been written at 8% on variable terms, reset to 14%, then 18, then 21, and at the same time, and this is the cruel part, the part that turned a hard year into a catastrophe, grain prices started to fall. In 1980, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union in response to the invasion of Afghanistan. And overnight, the biggest buyer of American corn and wheat was gone. By 1982, corn was back down to $2.50 a bushel. By 1984, land that had been selling for $2,200 an acre was going for $900. Ray Halverson's $62,000 note, now compounding at 21%, ate his entire crop in 1983, and half of his crop in 1984. Marv Carlson fell behind in the winter of '83, and he never caught up. The Peterson brothers held on longer than anybody. They sold equipment first, then a 40-acre piece, then another, then the house their grandfather had built. And Arlen Vance watched from a position of almost unbearable stillness. He had no debt. He had, by the end of 1984, more than $190,000 in the Independence Bank, money that had accumulated quarter after quiet quarter, while the neighbors had been building, and he had been waiting, and he had been watching land prices fall, and he had been reading, every week, the small notices in the back of the Buchanan County Journal. Sheriff sales, bank auctions, names he had known his entire life. And I want to pause here, because this is the part of the story that most people miss. Being quietly laughed at for 30 years, out of step with every man you know, that is not stubbornness. It's not even wisdom exactly. It is the discipline of refusing to mistake the temperature of a particular decade for the climate. Edgar had learned that in 1932. Walter had carried it through 56. And Arlen had kept it through the Soviet wheat deal, through the 21% interest rates, through every young man from the Farm Bureau with a pamphlet and a pen. What looked from the outside like timidity was, from the inside, just a man refusing to be the first generation in his family to forget what was in that book. And then, in November of 1986, the Journal ran 14 foreclosure notices in a single week. Arlen started doing something he had never done in his life. On Sunday afternoons, he would drive the back roads of Buchanan County, alone, slowly. He would stop at fence lines. He would walk across fields that were not his, checking the soil with his hand. He would look at the drainage. He would take small notes in a pocketbook, not the ledger, never the ledger, just a little pocketbook with a pencil stub. And in March of 1987, when the courthouse auctions began in earnest, Arlen Vance was ready. The money was in the bank. The land was at a price his grandfather Edgar would have recognized. The rule had not changed in 31 years. He had simply waited for the market to come back to meet it. Which brings us back to that cold morning in April, behind the courthouse, with the gravel and the diesel and the 60 men in their turned-up collars, and a 58-year-old man in a patched coat raising his hand. But here's the thing. Buying the land was not the hardest part. The hardest part came that summer, on a front porch, when a pickup truck pulled into the drive. And that's the part of the story we have to finish. By the end of June 1987, Arlen Vance owned, free and clear, 880 acres of Buchanan County farmland. His original 180 that his grandfather had broken sod on in 1897. The 240 acres of the Halverson Place, bought that cold morning in April. 220 acres of the Carlson ground, bought at a second auction in May. And a 240-acre piece of the old Peterson land, bought directly from the bank in June when First Prairie Savings finally stopped waiting for a buyer and took what Arlen offered them in cash, 880 acres. The sum of 3 ledgers, Edgar's, Walter's, and his own. 31 years of cash net, and a rule that never moved a word. And now here's the hard part, because this is not a story about winning. Let me tell you what Buchanan County felt like that summer. Arlen would drive into Independence for coffee or for hardware, and men who had known him his entire life would either nod too quickly or not look up at all. At the co-op, a conversation would stop for a half second when he walked in, and then start up again, just a little too loud. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something harder to name. It was the confused, unsorted grief of a community that had just watched 4 good families lose land that had been theirs since the 1880s. And had then watched the quietest man any of them knew. The man in the patched coat. The man they had been polite to for 40 years. Walk into a courthouse and buy it. Now nobody in that county had the right language for what Arlen was. He wasn't the villain. The villain was a bank in Cedar Rapids. Or Paul Volcker. Or the Russians. Or the year 1979 itself. But Arlen was the one they could see. Arlen was the one with the checks. And then came a Tuesday evening in July. Arlen was sitting on his front porch, alone, when a pickup truck pulled into his drive, and it was Ray Halverson. Ray had been working at the grain elevator in Independence since losing the farm. His son had moved to Cedar Rapids and taken a job at a factory. Ray got out of the truck slowly. He was a big man, and Arlen had known him since they were both boys, and Arlen had never seen him look as small as he looked that evening walking across that gravel drive. Arlen stood up. He didn't call out. He just waited. Ray walked to the bottom step of the porch, and he stopped there. He didn't come up. He put one hand on the railing, and he said, "Arlen, I come to ask you something, and I don't know how to ask it." Arlen gestured very quietly to the other chair on the porch. Ray didn't sit. He just stood there at the bottom of the steps with his hand on that railing, and he said, "My grandfather broke that ground. My father bought it back in 46 after his father lost it. I don't know what I'm doing here, Arlen. I guess I'm just asking. Are you going to farm it yourself, or rent it out, or sell it on to somebody else?" Now, I want you to pay attention to how Arlen answered him, because Arlen did not lecture. He did not mention his grandfather's ledger, though it was sitting in the roll-top desk 15 feet behind him, on the other side of the front room wall. He didn't mention the entry from November of 1932 with Ray's grandfather's name on it. He didn't mention any of it. He told Ray that he intended to farm the Halverson place himself for one season, just the one. And after that, he said, he would like Ray to farm it, on shares, 50-50. Arlen would pay for seed and taxes. Ray would pay for fuel and labor. They would split what came off the ground down the middle. He said it the way a man proposes a trade of tools across a fence. Practical, flat, no weight on any particular word. Ray stood at the bottom of those porch steps for a long time. He looked out at the yard. He looked at his truck. He looked at the floorboards of the porch. And then he said, "Arlen, I laughed at you. In '74, when you didn't come in on that 80-acre piece, I laughed at you. I want you to know that." And Arlen said, and this is the line that mattered, the line he had been preparing for without knowing it since his father's funeral in the summer of '56. He said, "Ray, your grandfather and mine broke sod within a month of each other. My grandfather kept a book. Yours didn't. That's the whole of it. It isn't better. It's just a book." Ray nodded once. He didn't say anything else. He got back in his truck and he drove home. By the autumn of 1987, Arlen had worked out share arrangements with Ray Halverson, with Marv Carlson's widow, Marv having died of a heart attack that February, and with the younger Peterson, who was 34 years old and had a wife and 2 children. Each of them was back on the ground their families had lost. None of them owned it, but none of them were off it either. And Arlen charged them, for their share, well below the going rate for cash rent anywhere in Buchanan County. He never told anybody why. He never needed to. The ledger said it for him, in a fresh entry he wrote that fall, in careful black ink, on a new page. A man who buys his neighbor's farm at auction and then farms it alone has bought land. A man who buys it and lets the neighbor work, it has bought something else. I do not have a word for the something else. But my grandfather's entry from 1932 is the reason I am able to. Now let me take you forward 7 years. 1994. Arlen is 65 years old. His nephew Caleb has come home from 4 years in the Marines and wants to farm. And one evening, Arlen sits Caleb down at the kitchen table, and he sets 3 ledgers on the wood in front of him. Edgar's from 1918, Walter's from 1935, his own from 1956. He walks Caleb through the 2 conditions from the winter of '49, the farm that feeds itself, the refusal to measure yourself by the neighbor's yardstick. He explains them the way Walter had explained them to him, plainly, without lecturing. And then he adds a 3rd condition, one that is not in Edgar's ledger and is not in Walter's, because neither of them lived long enough to see what Arlen had seen on that courthouse morning in April of 1987. He writes it in his own hand, on a fresh page, and he reads it out loud to Caleb. If the rule ever lets you buy what another man has lost, you owe that man a seat at the table. Not his land back. The ledger does not lie, and the auction was legal. But a seat, a share, a way home. Otherwise, what you have bought is not a farm. It is a grudge dressed up as property, and a grudge ruins the soil faster than any drought. He taps Edgar's entry from 1932. He taps his own entry from the fall of '87, and he pushes all 3 ledgers across the table to his nephew. After Caleb leaves that night, Arlen walks out onto the front porch. It's dusk. The light is doing that thing it does in Iowa in late summer, where it goes gold and then blue and then gone, all in about 20 minutes. And across the road on the old Halverson place, a tractor is coming along the fence line, headed home. It's Ray, driving slow, the way Ray always drove. Arlen raises his hand. Ray raises his. Neither man calls out. They have been doing this, across that fence line, for 7 years now, and they will do it, without a word passing between them, for 12 more, until the winter Ray goes in his sleep at 73, and Arlen walks in his pallbearer's suit at the front of the church. And that's the end of the story, except for one thing. If you go out to that farmhouse today, and you walk into the front room, and you open the top drawer of the roll-top desk, you will find 3 tan ledgers stacked one on top of the other. Edgar's on the bottom, Walter's in the middle, Arlen's on top. And on the last page of Arlen's book, dated the fall of 1987, there are 4 lines in careful black ink. And next to those 4 lines, pressed flat between the pages like a leaf a child might save, is a small square of brown canvas, frayed at the edges, cut a long time ago from the patched elbow of a coat.